Colin Powell, the first Black U.S. Secretary of State, whose leadership in several Republican administrations helped shape American foreign policy for years, has died from complications from COVID. Now, his family just made that announcement on Facebook. Colin Powell was 84 years old.
We've got some breaking news now. Colin Powell has died from complications from COVID. That's according to a Facebook post by his family. Powell was the first Black U.S. Secretary of State whose leadership in several Republican administrations helped shape American foreign policy in the last years of the 20th century and the early years of the 21st. He was 84 years old.
We're going to interrupt Tom's remarks with breaking news. Just breaking this hour, politician, diplomat, four-star general Colin Powell has died of COVID-related complications. This news just breaking right now. Of course, Joey was a family friend. He has served multiple presidents, both sides of the aisle, and was incredibly accomplished on the world stage. Colin Powell dying now of COVID-related complications. His family just released a statement confirming this information.
Yeah, and Colin Powell had a dominant presence in American politics over the course of 30, 40 years. He first came onto the national stage when he went to work for Ronald Reagan, later for George H.W. Bush. He was an integral part of putting strategy together for the first Gulf War and played a pivotal role. He soon after the first Gulf War, along with Norman Schwarzkopf and others who were seen as being successful commanders of that very successful effort to take Iraq out of Kuwait and to liberate Kuwait. He became a giant in the Republican Party and was actually in 95 and into 96. There are many people trying to persuade Colin Powell to run for president against Bill Clinton. He chose not to do that, but did once again get into the administration, get into the White House in 2001, working as Secretary of State for George W. Bush. And according to a post on Facebook, Mika, the Powell family broke the news this morning.
The first, by the way, African-American Secretary of State. And the family says General Colin L. Powell, former U.S. Secretary of State and chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, passed away this morning due to complications from COVID-19. He was fully vaccinated. We want to thank the medical staff at Walter Reed National Medical Center for their caring treatment. We have lost a remarkable, loving husband, father, grandfather, and a great American, the Powell family. And the family pointing out, Joe, that Colin Powell had been vaccinated and yet still passed away due to COVID-related complications. So I know a lot of the discussion we had this morning was on the data about infections going down. But obviously, this latest breaking news shows how COVID is still very much part of the fabric of American life right now.
Right. And there are breakthrough cases, and certainly people with compromised immune systems, older Americans as well, are still facing some complications. And tragically, in the case of Colin Powell and some others, sometimes die even after being vaccinated. Colin Powell, though, going back to his career, he was, again, one of the most respected voices in foreign policy through the years. Obviously, Mika, I know your father had the greatest respect for General Powell. And as you said, first Black Secretary of State. And again, his reputation was burnished from the first Iraq War, and he became really a spokesman for moderating force. There was a Weinberger doctrine that was put out in the 1980s to try to avoid some of the mistakes we made in Vietnam. Colin Powell was one who extended the Weinberger doctrine. And what he said is that when the United States goes to war, they don't want a fair fight. And the Powell doctrine was that you use overwhelming force, you achieve your stated goal, and then you bring the troops home. It was a sort of thing that, unfortunately, we haven't listened to as a country, because Colin Powell also said, like Cap Weinberger before him, before you commit troops to battle, you have your end game already set out. What is a goal you seek to accomplish? And unfortunately, tragically, in the second Iraq War, that didn't happen. Colin Powell, his unblemished reputation, did take a hit when he went before the United Nations and used information that was given to him by the Bush administration and by some members of the intel community to suggest that Saddam Hussein did, in fact, have weapons of mass destruction. They did not. That's something that General Powell regretted, certainly regretted the rest of his life. But make no mistake of it, while that was a blemish on his resume, he served this country and he served it proudly for years. He was a trailblazer, and he was someone that I had the greatest of respect for and looked up to, Reverend Al. But make no mistake of it, Colin Powell, a real trailblazer, not only in the U.S. military, but also in American politics.
No question about it. He was a trailblazer. He and I were certainly of different politics, but I always respected him, and we always had respectable conversations. But people ought not to also forget that he was not only well respected, he was very popular. I will never forget, in the mid-90s, there was many that were urging him on the Republican side to challenge Bill Clinton for Bill Clinton's reelection in 1996. And it seemed as though he might have done it. He was leading in the polls. So he was a dominant political presence. He was well regarded because of his military background. And then when he became Secretary of State, I remember when George Bush won that election and they were going through the process of selecting the cabinet, I ran into Colin Powell in the Capitol building, and he says, "Give us a chance, Reverend Al. We're gonna do some things you'd be surprised of." He would always reach out. He would always try to be, even though he was with the Republican side at that point, he would always try to be the voice of reason. And then later, you're right, he did take a hit with the Iraq War. He went with the information given him. He became the face of it, and he took some blemish there. But let's not forget, he broke ranks when others wouldn't and supported Barack Obama for president, both in 2008 and in 2012. And I think Colin Powell's endorsement of Barack Obama was a decisive move forward and a real plus for Barack Obama. So he's a man that stood on principle, a man that would even break with his party when he felt his party had gone awry. And he certainly joined you and other Republicans in his analysis of Donald Trump and the demise of the Republican Party under his leadership, Joe.
It is such an important thing to remember on this day where we're remembering the life of former Secretary of State Colin Powell, that while there are still members of the Republican establishment who have nothing to lose in their later years, and Robert Kagan talked about this in his essay a few weeks ago, they still are quietly refusing to speak out against the horrific behavior of Donald Trump and the slide towards illiberal leadership there. Colin Powell in 2008 came out and had enough of the Republican Party's drift. He supported a Democratic president in 2008, and he has been critical of the Republican Party's direction ever since. And Mika, it's important to remember, and let's underline this, we're talking about Colin Powell as America's first black Secretary of State. He was also America's first black national security advisor, the position your father held. He was America's first black chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And yes, he was America's first black Secretary of State. And again, the influence he had throughout his life was extraordinarily positive for the most part, except obviously for his UN testimony where he was given bad information.
Our love and prayers go to his wife, Alma, this morning. And just to think about that career, Joe, that you just laid out, which we could talk about for hours. He has so many accomplishments. This is the son of Jamaican immigrants who grew up in Harlem and the South Bronx and went to New York City public schools. Colin Powell joined the ROTC program. He ended up serving in Vietnam, and his first political position was becoming a White House fellow, but he was ultimately a 4-star general, and he was a professional soldier for 35 years.
Yes.
Along with becoming a politician and a diplomat, and so many different firsts. His rise is really incredible. And again, the son of immigrants, which is something that's important to talk about, especially these days, and what we've seen over the past 4 years. And I know that Secretary Powell was extremely disturbed by much that transpired during the Trump presidency.
He most certainly was.
We've got a bit of breaking news we could bring you. This is coming from the Facebook page of Colin Powell. Now, he is the former US Secretary of State and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Well, according to his Facebook page, he passed away this morning due to complications from COVID-19. The statement on his Facebook page says he was fully vaccinated. We want to thank the medical staff at Walter Reed National Medical Center for their care and treatment. We've lost a remarkable and loving husband, father, grandfather, and a great American. That from the Powell family. Colin Powell, retired 4-star general. He served as the 65th United States Secretary of State from 2001 to 2005, and he was, of course, the first African-American Secretary of State before the election of Barack Obama as president. Colin Powell and his successor, Condoleezza Rice, were the most highest-ranking African-Americans in the history of the federal executive branch. He also served as the National Security Advisor for the states and as the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He had retired recently, and in his retirement he wrote his autobiography, but he was still carrying out public speaking addresses across the country and abroad, and was also Chairman of America's Promise, which is a non-profit organisation to try to help mobilise people from every sector of American life to build their character and competence. So there will be many tributes undoubtedly coming into him in the current minutes and hours. But for now, all we have is the information from his Facebook page that General Colin Powell, the former US Secretary of State and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has passed away due to complications from COVID-19.
What a sad day, Savannah. This is a man who was not only prominent in his field, from soldier to statesman, he was also a very kind and pleasant man to interact with for all of us who had the opportunity to cover Colin Powell and to see his leadership. He rose through the ranks, as Andrea described, and made a huge impact as a figure leading soldiers, as a statesman on the world stage, not without controversy. Of course, he presented the information when he was working for George W. Bush before the UN about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq that proved to not be accurate. And also, he was someone who put forward a huge imprint on the discourse of the time with his calm demeanor and also his experience, intellect, and knowledge. He remained on the national stage for all of these years as someone who could connect to the service members on the ground level as a military leader and to the political and statesman level of diplomacy around the world. A giant figure, one who will be remembered, and what a shock to lose him in this way with complications of COVID after being fully vaccinated, according to his family. Yeah. Savannah?
He was a trailblazer for sure, born in the Bronx to Jamaican immigrants, rose through the ranks of the Army, first African-American National Security Advisor in the 80s under President Ronald Reagan, then later first African-American Secretary of State, decorated multiple times, a 4-star general. Colin Powell, a legend in American politics and foreign policy.
Yeah, we're going to have a lot more on this throughout the morning, as well as on MSNBC and NBCnews.com. We will return most of you right now to today. This has been an NBC News special report.